8 South American nations meet in Brazil to forge a common policy on the Amazon rainforest. But there are deep divisions on oil exploration and deforestation, as well as conflicting domestic interests. So, what will this summit achieve? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. It's been 14 years since the last summit of Amazon rainforest nations, a time during which the impact of climate change has worsened well beyond what might have been imagined back then. Floods, wildfires and extreme temperatures have destroyed lives and communities worldwide. Meanwhile, countries are missing international targets to reduce emissions as the climate crisis worsens. Leaders meeting in Brazil all agree on the need to act, but big divisions remain on what's to be done. We'll talk to our guests shortly at Al Jazeera's Latin America editor, who's in Belém, where that summit's being held. But first, a closer look at the Amazon rainforest and its connection with the nations taking part. The area is vast, around twice the size of India. It extends into 8 South American countries, including Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Peru, and Venezuela. It is a vital part of the global ecosystem, helping to regulate everything from carbon emissions to water cycles. But its sustainability is at risk after decades of reckless exploitation. Let's speak with our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, who's in the Brazilian city of Belém, known as the gateway to the Amazon. Lucia, great to see you. What does this summit aim to achieve?
Well, the aims, of course, are very grandiose. Whether or not they can even do a tiny amount or make any inroads is yet to be seen, because this is going to be the 4th presidential summit of Amazonian countries. Remember, this is not just Brazil, it's all of the countries that have Amazon rainforest. And they will be joined also by other countries on the 2nd day of the summit, the 2 Congos and, of course, Indonesia, which also have very, very large rainforests that need protecting. What they are trying to do is revert climate change, revert degradation, deforestation, increase the rights of indigenous people and others who live in the Amazon region. Here in Brazil, for example, there are 11 million people who live in the Amazon who are going hungry. They're impoverished. They have no sustainable way of making a living, or it's certainly not a decent way of making a living. There's also slavery or slave work in this region. Very little presence of the state. The indigenous populations don't have access to health care, to education. There's a whole list of demands and needs by civil society, which will be presenting the heads of state with a list or guidelines, if you like, and demands for what they should be considering and what they should take action on. Whether they will or not is the big question, of course.
Some of these nations as well have got domestic issues that they're dealing with at the moment. They're hardly focused on climate issues, are they? I mean, how you say whether they will or not, but how difficult is it going to be for them to reach consensus?
Well, there are some areas in which they will reach consensus. For example, the transfer of science and technology between countries like Brazil, which are more developed, to others that are less developed. That should be a no-brainer. It should be easy. But the big elephant in the room here is oil exploration and exploitation in the Amazon region. I'm right, as you say, at the mouth of the Amazon River. Just on the other side of that river is the rainforest. This is the area, or one of the areas, that oil companies want to exploit. And they argue, and this is true also in countries like Ecuador and many others in the region, who insist that in order to have development in their country, they need to find ways of extracting oil here. Environmentalists will tell you that that's absurd, not only because it contaminates rivers and soil, but also because they say humanity is living at a time when we should be weaning ourselves completely from oil. I just spoke a short while ago to the coordinator of Climate Observatory, and he said something that surprised me a lot. He said the reason why there's so much resistance is that oil companies and countries that have oil want to squeeze the last dollar, if you like, out of those resources before it becomes completely impossible to use oil anymore, before it becomes redundant with other sources of clean energy. So, Brazil's president says he wants zero deforestation, zero contamination, but it's difficult for him to go ahead with that. He won't have the support of many people in his country.
And very briefly, Lucia, what role are indigenous peoples, if any, playing at this summit?
The indigenous people are very present at this summit. They've brought their leaders from all over the Amazon region, and not just of Brazil, but other parts of South America. They are insisting on their rights, territorial rights, rights to their culture to be preserved and respected and promoted, health education, but particularly this very sensitive area of territorial rights. It's not just a matter of living in areas that are supposed to be reserved, but they need those areas to be protected from poachers and from economic interests that want to encroach on them.
Our Latin America editor, Lucia Newman, reporting from the gateway to the Amazon. Lucia, many thanks indeed. Right, let's bring in our guests who are all joining us from Brazil. From Belém, where that summit is being held, Carlos Perez, Professor of Tropical Conservation Ecology at the University of East Anglia. From Sao Paulo, we have Jan Rocha, a freelance journalist and writer. She's authored several books on Brazil, including Murder in the Rainforest. And also in Belém is Bram Ebus, lead journalist and research coordinator at Amazon Underworld, a collaborative investigation into the presence of criminal activities and armed groups in the region. Welcome to you all. Let's start with you, Carlos. President Lula da Silva said that he's got high hopes for this summit. He said that for the first time, we're going to have a common policy for the Amazon for preservation, security and borders. But how difficult is it going to be to reach consensus with all these nations taking part? To what extent will Lula have to water down his expectations?
Well, yeah, this is fairly unprecedented because the heads of states from all Amazonian countries, all 9 Amazonian countries, are going to meet here. And Brazil basically leads the way, both in terms of the politics of forest conservation, but also in terms of the levels of forest degradation. So I think it's going to be a very heterogeneous meeting. It's going to be very hard to reach a complete consensus. But it's been a remarkable gathering previous to the meeting of the heads of states. And the idea is that they're going to propose a so-called Amazonian parliament. How exactly that's going to be done is anybody's guess. But yeah, I think, I'm here in Belém with a huge amount of security waiting for all the heads of states and the main Amazonian and the main tropical forest countries, including the big bloc for the Congo Basin and Indonesia.
Jan, what's your feeling on this? Is President Lula da Silva going to have to water down his expectations on this?
Well, it's a meeting of several countries with very different situations in terms of what they're actually doing in the Amazon forest. There's a lot of oil exploration going on already. So Lula, who's very good at sort of finding the middle way, because he has to do that politically all the time, I think in the end there will be a declaration that states important things like the importance of saving at least 80% of the Amazon forest, but will also not take a firm stand against oil exploration, because Brazil itself, there's a move by the state oil company to drill for oil in the mouth of the Amazon, and Lula favors that. So he has to take a rather middle stand on all this. He has to maybe fudge it a bit. But it seems to me that the important thing of this meeting is exactly the Amazon countries coming together to take a stand and demand a greater voice in all the climate discussions which are going on at the various COPs and international meetings. And also very significant is the fact that just before the official summit, Indigenous people from all over the Amazon came together in Belém, almost 1,000 of them. And what they said at their meeting was that we want a voice in what's happening. we want to be heard, because without us, there is no future for the Amazon. So the indigenous people are talking to the Amazon country leaders saying, we want a bigger voice at your table. And the Amazon presidents are saying to the world, we want a bigger voice in climate discussions.
Okay, I want to come back to this issue of indigenous peoples and what role they should be playing at this summit and the future conservation of the Amazon region. But Jan, Ecuador and Peru are currently dealing with their own domestic issues, which could distract them, couldn't it, from environmental concerns? I mean, is protecting the Amazon a priority for all of these nations right now?
Not necessarily. I mean, Lula has decided to make it one of his priorities, but he also has a whole load of other problems to deal with. But at least he's committed himself to zero forest clearing, zero deforestation by 2030. It's not easy because he has a sort of broad front, a coalition government, which includes parties which don't see it the same way, which believe in mining and farming in the Amazon. And after all, he's taken over after 4 years of very destructive policies in the Amazon from the previous president, Jair Bolsonaro, who actively encouraged illegal mining, illegal farming, land grabbing, and so on. So he has to play. Lula is playing a leadership role. He wants this leadership role for Brazil. Brazil, after all, is the country with the biggest share of the Amazon. But for none of these countries is it easy to take a sort of 100% stand in favor of the Amazon. They have to deal with their internal issues as well. They have to deal with climate deniers within their own countries and people who believe in oil drilling and oil exploration. Venezuela, after all, depends on oil, though it's mostly offshore. So it's a question of juggling all these different interests, coming up with a declaration at the end which states certain things. And one of the things I think it will say is to criticize the protectionism of European countries, and also to say, where's the money? Where's all the money which is promised, $100 billion to developing countries for protecting the climate?
Bram, as Jan was saying, Lula's pledged to eliminate illegal deforestation by 2030, as has President Petro of Colombia. Is that target achievable? I mean, given the various criminal groups that are expanding their activities right across the region?
Thanks for that question. I think we shouldn't blind stare ourselves on the number of deforestation because, to be frank, zero deforestation by 2030 sounds good, but it's very unrealistic. What we observed in the Amazon when we started investigating in the field is that 70% of the Amazon municipalities in the 6 main countries that share the Amazon is under criminal control. So this actually means that non-state armed groups and gangs are deciding who can enter, who can leave, who needs to pay taxes to criminal networks in extortion fees, and which are the main economies dominating daily life and also damaging the Amazon. What we see is that their respective governments are not able to enter these areas due to security concerns. So, of course, there's governance, but it's criminal governance. So I think the governments, when they speak about deforestation and mitigating environmental damages, they need to regain the confidence of populations they've abandoned since many decades, or maybe even never had a presence in the Amazon. And they should tackle criminal networks because they are running the show. And the revenues of illicit economies oftentimes are larger than the budgets of governments to combat them.
So, Bram, you would argue that security must be high on the agenda at this summit. What can be done to stop these criminal gangs?
So it's very important that all the presidents come together for a starter. But security must be on the agenda because we see rising homicide rates throughout the whole Amazon. We see an enormous number of massacres in rural Colombia in the Amazon. And we know that these organized crime networks are able to forge supply chain relations, to collaborate across the borders in a sort of criminal diplomacy, despite linguistic and cultural barriers, of which the governments should be jealous because they haven't managed yet to cooperate fully in the Amazon to tackle these criminal networks. So we need better communication, joint solutions. But of course, we don't only need to apply the stick, but we also need to help local populations develop economic livelihoods, sustainable future plans, to have an alternative besides the illicit economy. Because oftentimes we see that these locals have no other economic opportunities than to participate in illegal gold mining, illicit crop farming like coca crops, the main ingredient for cocaine, or other economies that destroy the Amazon. So lastly, if you are an inhabitant of the Amazon and you need to choose between feeding your children or conserving the forest, you always will opt for feeding your children first.
Carlos, just how close to tipping point is the Amazon rainforest? How long before the damage that's being done to it becomes irreversible?
Well, we're already up to 20% in Brazil, and 15% for the Pan-Amazon, all 9 countries. And the estimates range from, let's say, if you get another 20% of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon alone, which is about 3/5 the whole region, we could already be, be way past that tipping point. Forests around the world account for 84% of all the carbon stored in all terrestrial ecosystems, and the Amazon alone is about 90 metric tons. That's about 15 years worth of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's absolutely imperative that we come to an agreement, and much of that agreement basically depends on indigenous peoples and local communities, which control something like 45% of the Brazilian Amazon alone. Indigenous territories, they serve a huge role in forest conservation because there's relatively little deforestation inside. Most of the deforestation is outside those areas. So at the moment, they're not actually getting a penny for this. So they are sort of unsung heroes. And you can see in this conference here that the local demand for participation at the table, if you like, is increasing. And we're seeing lots of indigenous.
Yeah. What are the chances, Carlos, of this summit recognizing and enforcing land rights for indigenous people?
Well, this has been going on for a while. I mean, of course, in the last 5 years, we've had a huge slowdown in the demarcation and sanctioning of new indigenous territories. But now this is with the Lula government, this is coming back again. The problem is that over the last 30 years, we've opened the floodgates of farmers from elsewhere in Brazil. And it is now very difficult to stop that frontier of land grabbing, logging, farming, cattle ranching, and now gold mining. And the enforcement capacity of the Brazilian government is still very small, very, very low. So I think Brazil does need international aid, and this is coming now with the Fundo Amazonia. But it's a tough ask because if you're going to control 5 million square kilometers with only about 30 or 35 people, that you're up against a huge battle.
Jan, do all of the region's governments recognize just how important a role indigenous people play in the conservation of the rainforest? President Lula da Silva created Brazil's first Ministry of Indigenous Peoples this year. But what about the other nations?
Well, I think it's a very different situation in the Andean Amazon countries, where indigenous people for a long time have been much more organized than they were in Brazil, where in a way organization has really just begun the last few years. I think in countries like Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, indigenous people are much more organized, have a much more important political voice already. So it's a very different situation. Even so, indigenous peoples who live actually in the Amazon forest have been pushed off their land, their rivers and areas have been polluted by oil companies exploiting and drilling for oil. So they're in the front line as to this. And as far as criminal activities go, as the previous speaker said, this is an activity which has flourished in the last few years in Brazil and in the others. Illegal criminal gangs often connected to criminal gangs in the south, in Sao Paulo and Rio, have taken over because the state, the government, has simply not been there. And I think this is one of the most vital things that the Brazilian government certainly has to do now, is to have the state active in these areas, much more enforcement in a way that's already begun. I mean, there's been a big drive to clear out illegal miners from the Yanomami area, for example, in the north of the Amazon. And just a few days ago, the biggest land grabber in Brazil, who'd been clearing forests and putting in cattle farming, was actually arrested and all his properties were confiscated. So the Lula government is beginning to move forward on those areas. But there's, as the previous speaker said as well, it's a huge area to police, to enforce, to control. And of course, the other side to it is providing jobs for people. If they can't work in illegal mining and illegal land clearing, what are they going to do? Where are the jobs? So that's very important. And scientists, of course, have shown that there are, if you leave the forest standing, there are jobs. There is an economy, a bioeconomy based on the forest, using its products, using essences, using pharmaceutical or developing pharmaceutical products. But it's a huge area and list of things that has to be done. And again, you need money for it.
As you say,
Lula has started, but there's a long way to go.
As you say, it's such a vast area, it is almost impossible to police. I mean, to do it properly, you're going to need the consensus of all the Amazon nations, aren't you?
You are going to need consensus, and also you're going to need within Brazil, because the Brazilian Amazon is divided up among different states, with sometimes with very conservative governments who actually actively support illegal mining and clearing of the forest. You have to deal with all these local differences as well, because in many areas it's a local or municipal government which is responsible for education, for health, and so on. So it's a very complex situation, and will need. I mean, at least Lula has a lot of experience in negotiation, but it's not going to be easy.
Bram, to what extent is outside funding important here? The international community gets involved. I mean, we've got US climate envoy John Kerry and France's President Macron are both in attendance at the summit. Do rich nations need to be persuaded to provide funds to protect the Amazon? How much are we talking about here?
I think rich nations already are convinced about the importance of protecting the Amazon, which is the world's largest carbon sink, and therefore it's crucial to preserve the Amazon to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But we also know that the Amazon is encroaching a tipping point in which it will become a net emitter, and therefore the Amazon can also become one of our worst enemies. So there is a global importance to protect the Amazon, and we know that a lot of funds potentially could be available, because we also know the Amazon countries cannot do this by themselves. But I think at first the Amazon countries need to show that they are serious, that they have a concrete agenda, and that they also have the technical capacity. For example, I was just listening to the other guest talking about the operations by Lula in Yanomami territory, pushing out illegal miners. But these illegal miners are being pushed across the border to Guyana, to Suriname, to Venezuela. So we have these migrating gangs and illicit activities. And I thought it was very important what was also mentioned, that one of the main land grabbers in Brazil was arrested, because oftentimes law enforcement goes after the low-hanging fruit. The locals wielding the chainsaw are managing cattle or mining, but they never, law enforcement never goes after the financiers of deforestation, but they need more investigative and technical capacity. But it's also very important, and this is where the global community comes into play, to investigate supply chains, because oftentimes the commodities that come from the Amazon, from deforested areas, being being meat, leather, minerals, hydrocarbons, they go to international markets. And if there's no traceability, there's a very soft response. So we need the international community, other countries in Europe, North America, but also in Asia, to step up, clean up their supply chains and fund efforts to protect the Amazon.
Bram, you say we're close to the tipping point here. How long have we got? And with so much to be done, is there enough time to do it?
As things go, no. This is why we need a concrete response. We need a very clear agenda at this Amazon summit. The possibility of an Amazon parliament sounds very good, but in reality, we don't really know what it's about. So we need concrete measures and political announcements like zero deforestation by 2030. We know that most presidents won't be around then in politics. It's easy to say, but they won't be responsible for it. So we need actions being turned into legislation and better cooperation and more money on the table for sustainable economies, regional law enforcement actions, responsibilizing international buyers, cleaning up the supply chain, better traceability. And I think if there's a clear agenda and proposals with a budget in the next few days, hopefully the international community can get behind this.
Jan, with Petro and Lula in office and Venezuela's President Maduro back at the summit after not attending any regional meetings in recent years, is there cause for optimism? Are you optimistic that this summit can achieve something concrete?
Well, I think I am optimistic to a certain extent. Just the fact that they're having it is important. Just the fact that before the actual summit, you had this meeting of nearly 1,000 Indigenous people voicing their demands. I think that's a cause for optimism too. I mean, obviously within the whole framework, you might wonder really what's going to be achieved. But as I say, just the fact they came together, they're recognizing the problems and they're voicing their demands and wanting to have a more active position within the world climate discussions, I think that is a cause for optimism. There's a lot of hard work involved. There's a lot of negotiation and diplomacy involved, but they've taken this step. I think that's important, must be recognized.
Carlos, do you share Jan's optimism?
No, absolutely. I mean, this is an unprecedented meeting, and this is where we need to start. There's been traditionally very little communication between Brazil and all the other Amazonian countries. And I think that, the Amazon Conservation Treaty has been very powerless to do anything. And I think this is a breath of fresh air. There are huge challenges ahead, but I think this is a big start.
But time is of the essence.
Time is of the essence because, even reducing or deterring illegal deforestation by 2030 is a huge target. And then also there is the definition of what is legal and what is illegal, because what can be legal now can become actually legal in 3 or 5 years down the line, depending on the on forest policy, particularly in Brazil. So yes, absolutely urgent that we control deforestation and fires in the Amazon, and I think this meeting is a big step forward.
Thank you so much, all of you, for taking part in today's Inside Story. Carlos Perez, Jan Rocha and Bram Ebuus. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget, you can see the programme again at any time by going to the website, which is at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.